Hello, I'm Oriana Fox. Thank you for tuning in to Multiple O's, the spin-off podcast for my talk show, The O Show. The O Show is a live performance piece that mines the conventions of daytime TV talk shows for all that they're worth. It features artists and other experts who have no difficulty spilling the beans about their lives and opinions, especially when they defy norms and conventions. So if you're interested in candid confessions, nonconformity, creativity, and mental health, you've come to the right place. I'm here with the philosopher and writer Nina Power, who's authored numerous articles on politics, feminism, and culture. She most often writes about the interplay between the personal and the political, including topics such as the feminization of labor within neoliberalism and the repercussions of state violence on mental health. In many ways, she's the perfect fit as a talk show guest, or rather, a particularly perfect fit for my chat show performance piece. Oh, this is not the version I wanted to read.
Oh, but that was actually surprisingly accurate. Most people still think I'm working at universities and stuff, so that was good.
Oh, good. So anyway, I'll just continue on from the last bit. In many ways, she's the perfect talk show guest, not least because she's publicly revealed her own struggles with mental health, with alcoholism and mania paranoia. Is that sort of an accurate description?
Sure. Why not?
I've invited her specifically to discuss her forthcoming book, What Do Men Want? In writing it, she's become an expert on mainstream masculinity and other aspects of the topic addressed on the O Show episode entitled Time's Up, Penis Down, Masculinity, Sexuality, and Me Too. What's more, she's an apt guest on my show, which is all about risky self-disclosure, in light of the fact that she's been in a lot of hot water for her views around gender and trans identity. She's dubbed herself uncancelable in the wake of the accusation that she's a fascist and a terf, trans-exclusionary radical feminist. Some of my audience will no doubt object to my engaging with her on this basis. In fact, potential guests on this podcast have already raised concern about appearing on the same platform. And to be honest, that terrifies and upsets me. Therefore, I'm admittedly excited and daunted in equal measure about speaking with you, Nina, today. But her willingness to engage in challenging conversations and her unflinching self-acceptance in the face of criticism fuels my curiosity. So, thank you for being with me.
For the record, I'd like to state that I'm neither a fascist nor a transphobe, and I have, absolutely no far-right views whatsoever, nor do I have any hatred in my heart for anybody, no more than anyone else does.
Well, I'm really glad to hear that.
Just in case you're worried.
I kind of gleaned as much. My first question is a rather kind of narcissistic question, which is that I asked you to watch that episode of the O Show that I just mentioned, and I was just wondering about your reaction to it.
Yeah, so I did watch it. I thought it was quite interesting. I liked the range of men. I particularly liked the guy who was working on fashion. I thought he was very, sort of learned and interesting.
Nina is referring here to the fashion historian and academic Sean Cole.
All of your male guests were lovely. And I actually noticed someone in the audience that I used to teach who is lovely. Boy.
Oh, that's nice.
I think what you're trying to say about masculinity in the sense of, not all men are bad and, there's a range of different approaches to this question is obviously entirely valid, and getting away from these kind of generalizations about masculinity as kind of being toxic or, sort of tarring all men with the same brush, something that obviously motivated my project and my work on masculinity as well.
Yeah, exactly. I see there's a lot of kind of overlap, but also I guess one thing that made me nervous in preparing that O Show was that I tried really hard to get a straight male guest, but at the same time, there wasn't a lot of straight men, I don't know, making kind of confessional work about being straight men, or like such a thing doesn't exist. There's nothing to confess. We all kind of know, or we seem to know what men want, what straight men want. And so there's no need to go out kind of professing. I mean, since then, I've come across various people who do that sort of thing, and that could have been guests. And obviously, there's lots of categories of men that are excluded or not included. Not that they're excluded, but just couldn't be included due to like restrictions of the event. But yeah, so I was interested in your research about like, it comes up in the panel and the questions about like sort of incel and just kind of alt-right male, I don't know, feelings, or I don't know, groups kind of came up in the discussion, but it wasn't a part of the guest presentations.
Yeah,
particularly.
I mean, I think there's been a lot of conflation in the sort of left-wing or liberal media of all, anything that kind of opposes some sort of guilty, masculinity. And I think when we're talking about things like gym culture and the incel forums, or what get described as kind of alt-right types of masculinity, I mean, in many senses they're really not, like, they're not particularly political. I mean, it would have been interesting perhaps to have someone who was like a bodybuilder, or someone who is very into kind of self-improvement. There's a lot of this in the manosphere, the so-called manosphere, a lot of men trying to improve their lives through physical fitness and sorting their lives out, really. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's great. I mean, in a way, the kind of the man who demands attention from women or thinks that someone should look after him is more the problem than the man who kind of sorts his shit out and gets his life together and hangs out with other men at the gym. Like, these are not bad men, right? And they're not necessarily even particularly political. So I think the idea that all of these things are somehow on the right is also not true.
Mm-hmm. I see what you're saying.
Like, as in, there's nothing to be afraid of in a certain way. And I think a lot of the problem is there's a kind of fear around an image of particular subcultures, or, the idea of the incel, like the kind of young man who wants a girlfriend and can't get one. I mean, this is why I really like the documentary TFW No GF by Alex Lee Moyer, where she actually goes and interviews some of the young men who are writing online, and takes a look at their life, and they're, invariably in very dire economic straits because they live in poor parts of America. And that whole economic aspect of masculinity, the idea that there's something called male privilege that applies to all men, I mean, isn't particularly relevant when we're talking about poor working class men, or men caught up in the opioid crisis, or men doing very dangerous work. The idea of male privilege is far too broad a term, and it sort of covers over far more than it explains. And I think if indeed you think that there are, or one thinks that there are forms of toxic masculinity, then simply placing men you regard as falling into that category over there and never speaking to them is never going to solve the problem. I think if there is resentment between men and women, or on the side of women against men, or on the side of men against women, whether it's accurate or not, whether we think that men should feel resentment or women should feel resentment, the only way to overcome that is to have a conversation with everybody about it. So what I've tried to say in the book is try to understand resentment on both sides, and to talk about an idea of reconciliation, particularly after Me Too, which obviously you drew attention to, to some extent in your show. Although it wasn't sort of discussed, that much. But I think there was a kind of historical reckoning, with this idea. It's also to do with technology. The internet allows for certain kinds of attacks on people using their names. It's a very kind of blunt weapon. Some men obviously committed suicide after various allegations, and I think everybody is kind of, I don't know how to put it, like, everybody's capable of harm. Like, I've definitely been harmful. I've definitely caused pain to people. Most people have, meaning to or not, usually not meaning to. But we're all capable of being, let's say, a harmful person at the same time as everybody is also a victim, right? Everybody's also, been hurt by other people. And I think everybody's a combination of both. Like, there are very few ideal or pure victims in the world. And, this idea that you can simply say of one entire group of people that they're responsible for harm actually inadvertently perhaps takes away the power from, let's say, women in this case. If you say that there's male privilege and, women don't have it, and, that men are overwhelmingly abusive or, against women and women are always victims, it actually diminishes women's power, whether it's sort of sexual or political, to think like that. So I think sort of meeting in the middle and actually having an honest conversation about harm and, resentment and, in a humorous way, perhaps, why not do it in a lighthearted way, but say what we really think. And, that I think that to me is the only way, not just around this question of masculinity, but also about every other question, when people are falling out over Brexit and, lifetime friendships are being destroyed because of disagreements over some issue. That's a very antagonistic and depressing culture. It becomes very, very sort of segmented and ghettoized, and, and I think people can change their mind if they're given good arguments, and if you think your position is right on something, you should be striving to sort of talk to people about it and convince them, using reason and dialogue and all of these old-fashioned things.
Absolutely. I mean, the discussion, well, I've heard you give various lectures and interviews about the book, and in it you talk about it being seen, the relation between men and women being a zero-sum game, like if one side is winning, the other one's losing. And it's a similar thing that happens with like the right and left politically. Like there's this kind of sense that if I concede at any point to the left, that's, a loss for the right, sort of, I don't know. And then what I'm getting at is that there's, I'm sure you probably know, let me see if I can find my notes on this. I'm forgetting the name of the person I want to bring up. Elizabeth Anderson. Do you know Elizabeth Anderson, the philosopher, like American, teaches at University of Michigan, I think? Talks about did a series of lectures about political atomization and just talks about it in those same terms of it being a zero-sum game and one that is emotionally charged, and we have these kind of fight or flight responses to each other in that context. But there are ways of facilitating conversations by presenting facts in a certain way. Anyway, if you don't know what it is, it's kind of hard to talk about it because I'm really not going to be good at summarizing it.
No, but I think there's a role for philosophy here, and I think everybody is amenable and capable of arguing and giving reasons for their position. I think what happens when some group of people say there's no debate or there's no dialogue, and then kind of try to shut down anyone who wants to talk. I mean, that's the problem. That's never going to, be ever going to end in anything, conciliatory. There's never going to be any negotiation. There's never going to be any recognition of rights on both sides or resentment on both sides or whatever you want to say. And I think the zero-sum game idea, which I do use a lot in the book, I think we're presented with a culture that pretends that human interaction is a zero-sum game, right? Either between men and women or, as you say, politically, the idea that if one party wins or gains something, then another party loses. And this is sort of integral to an entire resentment industry, if you like, and words like privilege and so on reinforce this. And I think life is much more complicated. I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to write this book was because reading all this stuff about men and masculinity, it just didn't relate to my experience of men. As somebody who has a lot of male friends and has had relationships with men and in a relationship with a man, it's so manifestly unjust. It doesn't capture, anything remotely like, how I feel about my male friends or people I've been out with, or my father or my brother, or, men in philosophy. It's just like, what are people talking about?
Yeah, I was going to ask if you had brothers, because I only have brothers. I also have male friends, and I'm close with my father, and I have a male partner. And it's because of them that I'm willing to give a chance to, or try to understand the appeal of people like Jordan Peterson, is that his name? I always get his name wrong. I always wanted to call him Jeremy for some reason. But yeah, so to try to understand that, yeah, I have a certain person in my life who I feel like, because he's really thrilled at seeing the left tear itself apart, because he's been attacked for being an ally, in the wrong type of ally or something like that, because of being white or whatever, I don't know, male. And so he just loves to see the left tear itself apart. And he's always saying to me, oh, there's nobody women aren't lining up to work in the coal mines and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I looked at a lot of the complaints of so-called men's rights activists, right? And in the book, I kind of take them seriously. At least I say, well, what are they actually saying? What is this resentment based on? Is it realistic? And I think those kind of claims, I mean, they do have quite a power. I mean, it's true. I mean, actual equality at the level of employment would mean more women doing more dangerous jobs. But again, that's a kind of zero-sum picture where it's like, everything has to kind of even out, for there to be justice, right? Or whatever we want to say, fairness. So, yeah. And I think, again, to say that women don't have power isn't true. Women have a lot of power. There's a certain kind of narrative that actually sort of, tries to push the idea that women don't, and that they're always kind of at the mercy of men. And, that doesn't capture things like flirtation and seduction, let alone like women's power in particular industries or anything like this, And so again, I wanted to have like a more nuanced picture. I mean, I think I don't take any delight when the left tears itself apart. I mean, I still regard myself as being on the left, I mean, I think, but I understand, I understand why people might, because this idea of the purity spiral is very, very accurate in describing what happens in leftist circles, where people strive to be more and more kind of, perfect in a way, and moral, and, to be absolutely correct about everything. And in order to maintain that position, you have to kind of outgroup people. You have to kind of chuck them out. And, scapegoating is a very old mechanism, and it functions in order to kind of strengthen a weak group, because then they can unite around the person that they hate. And the left have a lot of hate figures, right? People they hate. You mentioned Jordan Peterson. He'd be one. And really, I mean, if you read Jordan Peterson's book, I mean, it really just tells young men largely, but it's not only read by young men, but it's also read by young women. And I went to see him speak, and he was very, popular in this way. But basically he just kind of says, like, get your life together. It's really very simple. You could say it's banal. You could say, why on earth do we have a culture that needs some patrician guy in a suit playing a father figure to sit there seriously and talk about, Christ and Jung and, sense of self and so on, to tell people to tidy their rooms. And yet it seems like we do need that. Like, at least a significant part of the culture responds very positively to this.
Is that, you think, because of the whole horizontal society that you describe of us being more like siblings rather than within a patriarchy with a kind of father figure?
Yeah, exactly. So one of the ideas I'd look at is taken from Mitterschleck, who writes this book, a few decades ago, called Society Without the Father, in which he suggests that the relationship between men and women has become, as you say, much more one of sibling rivalry, so that there's a kind of flattening out, and I would also say a kind of infantilization, right? As consumers, we're used to our desires in a way being sold back to us, and this idea that if we want something, we can have it. It's a very, very infantilized world that's kind of post morality in certain ways, which is, maybe one way of explaining why some people have grabbed onto a morality, the kind of, if we want to talk about social justice and, the kind of very punitive culture that sees disagreement as a problem and sees white men as the worst thing that ever existed. And, I mean, it's, when we're talking about men as a category, it's absolutely true that most violence comes from men, interpersonal violence, right? So any form of extreme behavior tends towards, how to put it, men are at the end of every form of extreme behavior, whatever it is, right? Whether it's violence or sports or anything like this. And women, if you look at it as a kind of curve, women are sort of basically in the middle for more or less every kind of thing. But it's really a very small proportion of men who do commit violence, right? So the idea that then, therefore, all men or all white cis men are, the enemy just by virtue of falling into that category, it just isn't true. It's just a false claim, And I also think that making people feel guilty for things that they can't help, so for example, what sex they are or what race they are, is an incredibly impoverished politics. Guilt is a very, very unhelpful political force, I would say.
Well, some people would say that guilt might be helpful, but shame would be the unhelpful one, because guilt is like you did something wrong versus you are wrong. So I think
that's true.
Shame might be. Yeah. If you actually did do a wrong, then guilt would be helpful.
Yeah, but, perhaps, but I think there's a way in which, we take the kind of guilt is about action, shame is about who you are, division, which I don't disagree with. I think, nevertheless, some ways in which, men saying or doing things that are not badly intentioned are often interpreted in the worst possible way. So that there is a kind of guilt around, if you some of these terms are quite funny as well, but things like mansplaining and manspreading and, these kind of terms, like these knowledgeisms that are there to kind of capture, particularly annoying behavior that we associate with men, even if it's kind of petty, right? Little thing. They, in a way, there's a kind of sense of, you could say it's like getting revenge, it's getting one's own back, right? After being crushed in seats or being talked at for hours at a party when you didn't want to be, or something like this. And, no doubt there are differences in male and female socialization. I think women are socialized to be more patient and more kind, even when they don't want to be. And then to stand up to that often gets you characterized as a bitch or worse, right? Whereas I think, maybe men are encouraged to think more highly of themselves in some ways, in some contexts. But nevertheless, even those sorts of irritating actions that we might then want to kind of guilt men into stopping doing are themselves ambiguous. Sometimes it's nice to have someone tell you a story and talk about something, even if it's something and sometimes people get overexcited and they get carried away. And, these are not things that I would necessarily want to punish men or women for at all, and so I don't know. Obviously there are problems where we feel like someone has committed a wrong or committed a harm. And if we feel like that this harm is not being acknowledged enough or in the right way, right? But again, that's a kind of collective discussion. And I think a few years ago, there was a lot more talk of, sort of redistributing justice and kind of alternatives to the prison system or to punitive forms of social punishment, which everybody engages in. So giving someone the silent treatment, for example, is a form of social punishment, right? We're all engaged in this kind of carceral logic. And I think that moment a few years ago has maybe shifted into something else now, that discussion of prison abolition and thinking about different ways of dealing with harm in a community has simply become, neglected or ignored. And now it's just punitive. The critique of the punitive has somehow been lost somewhere along the way.
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know enough to agree or disagree about that particular thing. I feel like there is a lot of attention to, I don't know, alternative systems, I guess, maybe in light of, I don't know, Black Lives Matter or something like that. I don't know, but I feel like that's going off in a direction I'm not wanting necessarily to talk about. But yeah, so if the goal of the book is some kind of reconciliation, between men and women. I was just wondering about, where trans people fit in with that. Like, do you want to reconcile everyone with everyone? Or, I mean, I would put it like, I guess maybe in a more PC way, that like if I were to advocate for myself along those lines, I'd say something like I'm pro reconciliation between all genders.
Yeah, I mean, I look at trans masculinity in the book, right? I look at people who've decided to opt into masculinity, if you like, as well as people who've decided to opt out of it, to some extent. And I look at a couple of trans men's memoirs where they talk about their experience of being treated as female and then their decision to transition and the reasons why they do so. So there's one by Charlie Kiss, which is very interesting and I think very honest, and it's very interesting what masculinity represents to those women transitioning. It's often seen as a way of disappearing to blend into a certain image of neutrality, to be accepted and respected in a different way, and those stories are often very moving. What does it mean to want to disappear visually, into the mass of maleness or something like this, and I think the interesting points in those memoirs come for me where the authors look at the different ways they're treated before and after transition, by men and by women, and there's comments about, being treated as like one of the lads, but also being treated in such a way that they are supposed to stand aside for women, that actually part of being a man is about caring for women and actually sort of moving aside for them, and things like this, and things that you wouldn't necessarily immediately associate with being a man. So there's some very, very important insights in these books.
And you said that one in one of those, I don't remember whose autobiography or memoir it was, but their feelings were taken more seriously when they were identified as female, whereas when they transitioned.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So part of being a man then, or being masculine, is then to have to hide your feelings or to have them, ignored to some extent. And I think quite a lot of men I spoke to were very upset about this, the idea that they either didn't have feelings or that their feelings weren't important or that they should hide them, or, and when you look at things like the male suicide rate, it's extraordinary. I mean, it's very, very high. I've had 3 male friends commit suicide, which is a lot, and it's extremely brutal, for everybody. And, and so asking about male suffering, particularly in those very extreme cases where men are suffering from depression and suicidality and even, going through with the act, is to ask about what's going wrong, and to say, we don't want men to kill themselves, right? It's a collective stain on our morality and our culture that it's the leading cause of death of men under 45. It's insane that this is the case. So to try to access those forms of male suffering such that they can be ameliorated, and it's not women's job to do that, right? I'm not suggesting that women need to go into some role of caring. I think, we're encouraged to do that. Nevertheless, there might be reasons why a lot of us are caring in certain ways, but it's not a kind of imperative that women look after men, but it is a kind of recognition of the specificity of that kind of male suffering, right? Again, not to downplay female suffering either. Women also attempt suicide in, too high numbers.
And trans people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, everybody suffers, right? Everybody has their share of suffering. This idea that some people's suffering is worth more than others is something I really want to oppose. I think we all live in a shared world. We live in a social world in which people have different desires. Sometimes they might conflict. As adults, we have to be prepared to confront the idea that sometimes our desires and our needs are different. and we have to negotiate them, and we have to come to a best solution for everybody, but that can't mean that one group of people, get everything they want. That's just not ideally how social life works.
Right.
So I think when people are upset, it's too easy to dismiss people on any side and say their resentment is unwarranted. If we take everybody's suffering seriously, then we have to sit down and say, well, what do you want? How do you feel? And talk, basically. And I think that's not what's been happening over a load of issues.
So my next question is kind of, I don't know exactly how to phrase it. So I recognize what you're saying as a version of, the role of feminism can be to highlight the way that our culture, whether it's patriarchy or not, our current culture is, and historically perhaps as well, is difficult or problematic for men as well as women, and or for everyone who, in living out their gender roles. That patriarchy is a problem for men just as well as women. Like, it seems like a fairly staple feminist position. But then there's also the feminist kind of position that one should decenter, one should put into the center the marginalized, right? If women have been, oppressed, and that therefore we should have an affinity with people who are oppressed. I guess it goes back to that same question of like someone's oppression is worse than another's, but in a sense, isn't it true though that it's worse to be a certain identity position than to be another, or that certain identity positions experiences are not in the center of discourse, like if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if this whole kind of oppression idea is based on perhaps like a faulty idea of what culture is. The idea that there's a center and that everyone's competing to kind of get to the middle and get attention, at this historical moment. And I don't think that social life functions in this way. I think there are certain contexts in which people feel freer to speak and have more power and more influence, and and these are kind of constantly shifting. And in a way, there is no mainstream culture. I mean, there are only human beings. There are only people, right? That people become structures and institutions have roles and influence, But actually, I would say most institutions don't particularly have any values these days beyond kind of preserving themselves and making money. So there's a kind of cynicism of institutions, not least in their take-up of various identities in order to kind of appear, relevant.
There is one institution, the Live Art Development Agency, I feel like is not, I mean, obviously they want to continue and into the future supporting artists to make live art, like risky, political, whatever. And they tend to support like the most disadvantaged artists on the basis of different identity characteristics, a variety of them. And yeah, within that, or like I feel like I don't fit in with that organization. I desperately want to, but I'm not other enough to fit in with them. So I think there is there is a mainstream culture, and there are other mainstreams within subcultures in a way. It's like if there's a mainstream live art culture, I think it's represented by Live Art Development Agency. And I feel even though I'm part of it, I still feel excluded on some level. Hamza Hassan and I have gone together to some like Live Art Development Agency events, but he's shy and therefore doesn't feel like he's one of them. Like they're the normal people. He's often referred to them as, but I'm just like, they're not the normal people. Those people are the normal. I don't know. So it's just, anyway, that's just my my thought about that. I don't know. It doesn't lead to a question.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there are obviously different tensions and different platforms and different institutions, and some are bigger than others, and some have different kind of incentives and, attitudes. And, that's all great. I mean, I suppose one thing I've been thinking about lately is the kind of hypocrisy in a certain way, which is like, if people say we must have more representation of this particular group, you want to say, well, give up your job, give it to someone who you think is disadvantaged.
And that is exactly what the director of the Live Art Development Agency has done, is in the process of doing.
Respect, because that's politically consistent. I admire people who are politically consistent, who have a set of beliefs that they've arrived at and then behave in such a way as to be absolutely consistent with those beliefs. That's ideal. I have respect for that. What I don't respect, I suppose, is people, speaking on behalf of minority groups or oppressed groups, but doing nothing actually to improve the lives of the groups of people that they claim to care about. Not stepping aside, not giving money, not supporting. When I was a really convinced communist, I did everything I could to redistribute my income and, all of these things. And this isn't, about that, but it's like I was really trying to be consistent with my politics. And I think it's too easy to have the right line and not do anything. It's much harder to address genuine points of conflict where there are disagreements over what words mean, what concepts represent, especially legally. And if we as a society decide to change the definition of words or concepts, then that does have implications, right? It's not just a straightforward thing. We go, all right, yeah, sure, let's change how we talk about reality, and everyone has to accept it. There are inevitably going to be issues, and every social movement, every civil rights movement, it's been a slow and complicated process of negotiating. It can't just be a demand. Having a politics that's purely based on desire is a very, very bad idea for everyone, because everyone has different desires.
And you have to accommodate the other. I mean, you can't just, as the whole Me Too thing, demonstrates, you have to have consent. To, pursue your desire with another person.
But even that, it's a very complicated thing. Me Too was often about punishing people for things that happened a long time ago in a very different climate, and that were being kind of reimagined as a different kind of situation. There was a lot of revenge in Me Too.
Yeah, I have some male friends who are fearful that, something that they did in the past is going to come back and haunt them, and it's going to destroy their present lives, because of mistakes they made, because who knows how they acted as a teenager or whatever. And it's, and in fact, the reason I made the show is because I happen to have, one of my close friends who's actually gay, a gay man, was really, had this, this response to Me Too, which was maybe more aligned with what you'd think a straight man would think, is it okay to have a dick or something, I don't know, like that kind of, and he's one of my best friends, and so that's what kind of generated the idea for the show, what of this question of is it okay, to be, to want to be a macho man, to want to be, sexually aggressive or whatever, how do we contain that or police that, or should we, was the kind of question. When I did repeat that anecdote actually to Martin Willis, the comedian on the show, he was just he had this very feminist response of just your friend sounds like a dick kind of thing, or your friend sounds like an asshole, or not particularly feminist or whatever. Yeah, I don't know what I'm saying.
I think, maybe it goes back to the shame guilt thing. It's look, men exist. They're in the world. It's
I guess this is what I'm wondering is with your research, I know you asked a lot of men what they want, and you obviously research these different male subcultures, whether they're alt-right or not. And I'm just wondering, what do you think it is? Why do you think it is that some men move towards a kind of alt-right or far-right position, while some can be, more, I don't know, centrist or even stay aligned with the left in many ways, or think of themselves as feminist or progressive, and still have that view of what view am I talking about? Of just like questioning or have a problem, like, I don't know, have a kind of problem with Me Too, or have a kind of questioning relationship to it, as opposed to just, yeah. So it's like there's different, responses, and why is it that
a lot of
some
people
men...
had problems with Me Too, I mean, including women. I mean, there's a very famous letter in France signed by Catherine Deneuve and many other women.
Right, yes, but why is it that some would move towards the right, the far right?
I think the right is also not what the left says it is. It's very easy to say of anyone who differs from you that they're right or far right or alt-right. I mean, you mentioned at the beginning that, I've been described as a fascist, right? This is so ludicrous to me, but it's not surprising, because if you say anything about any of the kind of current leftist mantras, if you question any of them, if you speak to people who have already been cancelled, then you are basically, for a lot of people, far right, even though none of your views actually are represented in that category. And I think a lot of what's happened is, people have been put off by some of the excesses of this very punitive, moralistic culture, have just said, look, enough, right? It doesn't relate to my life. It's not reality. I don't want to be part of this kind of mobbing and, judging and so on. But the moment you do that, then you're kind of sent, into this image of the alt-right or the far right. And, I really don't think that a lot of complaints that men have, even really obnoxious men in the men's rights activist movement, could be really described as far right. These are not genocidal maniacs. These are not authoritarian men. These are not, men who want to use the state and corporations to establish a 1,000-year Reich. It's whatever, whether we're talking about historical fascism. I think a lot of people today don't know what they mean when they say fascist or far right. They actually don't really have a concept. It just stands in for someone I don't like, who I disagree with.
I see.
So I think if we, when people talk about the alt-right or the far right or, sort of masculinist movements being like this, I think we have to be really precise. A lot of what I encountered was not particularly political. Unless you think that going to the gym automatically signals some sort of political allegiance, right? Which I don't think it does. A lot of these sort of discussions and forums are not political, particularly. I don't know. But your question about male feminists, I mean, that there's a kind of joke though about male feminists, because they often turn out to be really awful people. And I would agree with this. That actually a lot of self-proclaimed male feminists on the left, a lot of them turn out to be very misogynist. People. Particularly to women who disagree with them. I think, I started to realize this more and more, that, if you're on the left, if you're sort of, sexually relevant to men on the left, then you're okay. And if you agree with them politically, then you're okay. But the moment you're either, neither of those things, you're, in trouble, right? You're not a welcome presence. I think a lot of women have had this experience, often very shockingly.
That sounds a lot like, I don't know, that sounds like the 70s or something. It sounds really archaic.
But I think history does repeat itself. I mean,
it's like take her off the stage and fuck her thing. That famous, that old chestnut.
Leftist activism is like that. I mean, why wouldn't it be? The world is permeated by sexual desire, right? The idea that just because people have good politics, they're gonna be exempt from libidinal feelings,
Right.
So I think, I'm quite suspicious now of men who describe themselves as feminists. I prefer it when they don't.
Oh, I wanted to ask about, so Penguin asked you to write a book about men. Is that right? So why did they ask a woman to write a book about men in today's context, where it seems so important to be authentic and to write from one's, lived, embodied experience?
Well, in the book, I do say, I'm a woman writing a book about men. It's like I'm not, I don't pretend to know what it's like to be a man. And I think there's something kind of playful and interesting about doing it. I mean, I don't claim to answer the question. I mean, obviously the title, What Do Men Want, is a joke about Freud saying, what does woman want, right? So it's like a joke, because there isn't an answer, obviously, to that question. But I like the playfulness of turning it around and saying, well, now it's like women's time to ask this question of men. And even that kind of the gesture of placing men in a category, which women are very used to having done to them, is also kind of like, I don't know, like a light-hearted gesture in a way.
Provocation.
Yeah, and so, I mean, I think they wanted someone who, has written a lot about feminism to readdress this question. And actually the second wave, there are lots of precedents for women writing about men in the second wave. I mean, bell hooks most famously, but many of the other second wave feminists, the implications of what they were saying were also positive for men. Obviously, some women were separatists. I talk about female and male separatism in the book as a kind of social or political possibility, because I think it's very interesting. I talk about men going their own way, this kind of more recent separatist movement, and I compare it to the 70s, very minuscule but existing female separatist movement. And so, yeah, I don't know. I think there's
all those solutions. I mean, when I read about lesbian separatism in the second wave, my thought was that, well, there's a demand that, like you said, of, that how one lives one's life must conform to one's politics in a very restrictive way. And which you say you admire, but I also think is maybe can be too much to ask of the individual. Like, shouldn't we be working to change collective structures rather than having to change one's individual life and behaviors?
Well, I think they're connected. I mean, it's like, I think part of that is maybe about accepting, because I think we do live in a very, like, the left has become very moralistic and very punitive, and it is about punishing individuals often. So there is an individualism on the left, which often invokes structures like white supremacy or heteronormativity or whatever to punish individuals, right? So it invokes the kind of, critique of the collective or the structural or the institutional, and then singles out individuals as bad examples of that thing.
Right. Like in that instance, I'm completely hypocritical. Like, how could I be? In fact, I've been questioned heavily when I made the show about female masculinity. What the hell do you, cis hetero woman with male partner and 2 children, why are you interested? What could possibly interest you about female masculinity? As if it's the sole property of queer identified people,
right? Or
that the way I live means that I'm necessarily heteronormative.
But, human beings are curious. I mean, like, we're interested in each other. And I think one of the things that gets lost is actually we're far more similar to each other than we are different, regardless of our particular identity and orientations and, preferences and whatnot. It's like, at the end of the day, we all just happen to be alive at the same time, right? I love this line. And, I mean, actually, a lot of the problems stem from the fact that we are quite similar and that we more or less want similar things. People want social recognition, they want attention, they want affection, they want sex, they want, whatever. They want to be admired, they want to be, so everybody's sort of competing for the same things, but using different means to get there. And I think, a lot of this positioning is a kind of strategy, it's a tactic.
Oh, yeah. So I thought it was funny when Douglas Lane asked you, how do I not get canceled? And part of me is tempted to ask you the same question, but I think it's the wrong question for my podcast, because my question is, how do you go on knowing you might be, will be, or have been canceled?
Sure. I mean, I think, to be honest, it's a good thing to be canceled. I actually think...
Yeah, in your response, in your blog, like, you're sort of like, I don't care what anybody thinks anymore, which is kind of the ideal position for attacking shame of any kind.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that I don't care. I mean, of course, I take seriously what people say, and if people want to argue with me and talk to me, I'm more than willing to listen. You know, I did that whole thing where I invited anyone, you know, and in recovery from my alcoholism, you know, I'd done terrible things and behaved really badly, and I had to, you know, I felt very, I wanted to apologize to people. You know, of course I did, for things that I'd said and done that were really inappropriate and stupid and upsetting, you know. So I think there's also a sense of like coming to terms with your own like flaws. And, you know, I think everybody, whether you have a, you know, crazy midlife crisis like I did or not, you know, at some point.
How old are you? Because it doesn't say on Wikipedia, and I just wonder like what the age gap between us is. Is that like a two-person? I can edit it out, but I don't know if you're one of those women who doesn't want to say.
I really want to ask you to guess, because I think this is really funny and embarrassing for you. But
I just think you're a few years older than me. I'm 43. I just turned 43.
Yeah. So you think I'm older than you?
I think you're older than me.
No, I'm not.
I just think that you're not older than me.
No, but
not because you look older than me, but just because you've achieved more than me. This is what I'm judging.
No, but you know, look, I'm 42, so I'm almost the same age as you.
Oh wow, okay.
But you know, also, but I'm not married. I don't have children. I also spent a year like trying to get fit because I was incredibly ill. You know, I was like in hospital, but you know, really unwell and out, you know, horribly alcoholic and unfit. So, like, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I did a lot of work when I was an academic, right? I wrote loads of articles and things like this. But part of the problem was I was a kind of like, you know, classic workaholic alcoholic, right? Where you use your own self-hatred to get you out of bed and work really hard, you know, so that you can reward yourself with a drink. I mean, this is like a absolutely classic, banal thing to do, you know. So, yeah, I mean, that's part of it. But I think everybody. How
embarrassing that I guessed you were older than me. Well, I don't understand why your birthday, your birth isn't anywhere on the internet. It seems.
Yeah, it probably is somewhere. I don't know. I don't
know. Maybe I didn't look that thoroughly, but anyway.
Well, look, it does. I mean,
because you and I are what we call exennials. Like it's like we're on the end of Gen X. I know you, because that's why I thought you were older. Because partly because of how much you've achieved, but also because of the fact that. You often seem to identify yourself as Gen X.
No, I do. So yeah, we're at the end of Gen X. Yeah. But I mean, the way I look at that is 68 to 82. I'm very interested in Gen X. So basically, it's also to do with one's experience of like things like the internet. So I didn't use the internet until I was an adult, right? So we had a childhood that was without the internet, you know.
That's right.
So that's another kind of way.
And I feel like there's a big difference between people who were raised with it and people who weren't.
Yeah, undoubtedly.
And especially along these kind of the lines of the, I don't know, like, I don't know, I don't know if it's being punitive or just like being, I don't know, insisting on a kind of authenticity of like, you should speak from your position rather than try to speak for others or, I don't know what it is exactly, but yeah.
Sure. And, you know, there's a really complicated set of things to do with technology and identity and how, you know, people are shaped by these things in different ways.
But you described yourself as a Luddite.
Yeah.
And one thing I did want to talk about was like your feeling about like algorithms, running our lives and deciding who we should meet or have sex with or whatever, and the loss of risky encounters. And then I thought there was a connection between what you talk about along those lines and on the O Show when I asked the panel like for their pickup lines, and they don't really have any. And I said to Martin, is it all apps for you? It sounds a little bit kind of nasty to say, is it all apps for you? But I didn't mean it as a criticism. I was like genuinely asking, and he was like, yeah, I guess so. Yeah. There's like a loss of that kind of, I don't know, maybe Hamza would think that's a good thing. Like, even extroverts are not good at pickup lines anymore.
Yeah. I mean, I'm very critical of, algorithms and apps in the book, right? So precisely for the reasons you identify, to do with risk and encounter and chance. And, I mean, the internet is a gigantic surveillance machine. I mean, the idea of putting everything online is not really a good thing. I mean, it's potentially very damaging. People are getting punished for things they wrote or, 10 years ago or something. It's like, oh dear, what have we done? If you put your whole life online. And so I look at this idea of like the blockchain for consent. This is one idea that someone has come up with, the idea that you record all of your sexual encounters and this will prevent later conflicts. And it's not successful, right? It doesn't exist.
Well, it's like, that's why we like to think of, that's why the idea that God is watching everything we do is a powerful moral tool.
Yes, that was actually ideal in many ways, right? That was a much better thing. Now we've got like big
actual surveillance technology.
Yeah, and then people snitching on you and like reporting you to the state, or it's not good. It's like the idea that only God can judge you is a very powerful idea. It's a lot better than anyone online can judge you and ruin your life, someone you've never met. So I don't know. I think
I mean, I prefer looking at it in terms of, like, what I talk about on the O Show a lot is unconditional thinking of yourself as a fallible human being with a constellation of qualities, positive, negative, and neutral, and there's no way to give yourself a global rating. You can only judge the things, your performances. You can't judge your whole self. It's impossible because we're always changing. We have long lifespans. Anyway, so
exactly.
It's a kind of similar view similar to like, oh, only God can judge you, but there's no God in rational emotive behavior therapy, which is what that comes from.
And some people will think you're great, and other people will think you're an arsehole, and people who know you will think you're both, right? Because everybody's both, and I think everybody has good days and bad days. Everybody, upsets people sometimes, or it's like, I think there's a kind of absence of forgiveness, like in this post-Christian culture, there's often a lot of moralizing, but very little forgiveness, and no possibility for atonement or, any of those things.
I mean, I'm not a big, I'm not big into forgiveness so much, but I do think that acceptance, unconditionally accepting other people in one's life and oneself is really important. But I'm often, questioned, like, what do you mean unconditional acceptance? Like, it doesn't mean you like the thing. You just kind of have to accept it as, something that you can either work to change or decide to ignore. But you can't, if you have that kind of rigid, I will not accept this, then that causes all these sorts of problems internally.
Yeah, I mean, I
think it's hard to forgive certain people. I think I wouldn't expect certain things to be forgiven, for example, like child abuse.
Yeah, sure. And again, these are like massive things that socially we don't deal very well with, either the people who commit these acts or the people who suffer from them, and yeah, I mean, I do think a lot of this kind of moralistic culture is often driven by people who can't forgive themselves, people who feel guilty about things they've said and done, but don't really want to deal with it and kind of project that onto other people. It's much easier to say, look over there, that person's bad, than it is to kind of look at yourself honestly and say, well, I'm a combination of good and bad like everyone else. And yeah, because it's tough. It's unpleasant to look in the mirror sometimes.
As much as I agree with what you're saying about, like, why should one person's suffering, I still feel unsure about this thing, though, like, because it's like the thing about structural racism. It's like, it's not that there is, a bad person who is racist. It's just we live in a racist society, and therefore there's, no such thing as reverse racism, or reverse racism isn't mirrored by the the overarching power structures that we live within. And therefore, it's the pain that one might feel for experiencing, I don't know, whatever, or for being called out for being racist or whatever, or being called out. Like the pain of being called out can never equal the pain of actually being discriminated against. So in that sense, there is a hierarchy of pain that one must attend to.
Perhaps. I mean, I think, my starting point is more that everybody suffers, right? So the idea that some people don't suffer isn't true, right? Even people that we might think are extremely privileged and, so on. And I think, this is almost like a Christian idea as well, really. And, again, it's like saying, if we accept that structural racism exists, then we have to say, how does it work, right? How are we as individuals? Structures are also individuals, right? Structures don't just exist like in heaven, right? They are real existing things.
And we perpetuate them with our actions.
Perhaps. But at the end of the day, it's like every institution is composed of people, doing and saying things and working and so on. And so it's like the practical question of how you want to address what you perceive to be as an inequality, the question of whether it comes from the group who are oppressed in a particular way on the basis of an assigned identity. And remember that identity works both ways. To impose an identity on someone is also potentially very negative. To say, because you are this, therefore you are like this. So identity is not neutral. It's not just something that people choose. It's something that's imposed on people.
Mm-hmm.
And historically, that's how it was used. It's like, you're a woman, therefore you shouldn't be educated or have the vote, and that your life should be dedicated to having children with your husband or whatever. That's an imposed identity. And the reason why people wanted to escape identity was precisely to not be pinned down in that way, and to say, like, I am this, but it doesn't follow that I must behave or do these things. So I suppose I would, maybe it's a question of separating out these different strands and saying there are acts, there are thoughts, there are behaviors, there are words, there are identities, there are institutions, and look at them all very specifically. And yeah.
Do you talk about other, in the book, do you talk about race? In all the things I've heard you speak about it, I never heard race come up. But,
yeah,
I've listened to every single thing.
No. I'm amazed at the amount of research you did. I'm highly impressed, actually.
Oh, that's good. I'm just I felt like I didn't give enough time to it, actually, even though I tried really hard. I still felt like I could have done more.
I don't know. To be honest, you've done more research than probably anyone else who's interviewed me ever.
So that's imposter syndrome for you. It's the insecurity fueling the activity, just like you were talking about with alcoholism.
Yeah, honestly. Anyway, that aside, no, and in a way, I think I say in the book, it's like, I don't want to talk about something that I don't know enough about. I think this idea that everyone has to talk about everything all the time and that this is what inclusion is, again, is not a very good thing. It's like, I find
it, personally, I teach art history.
Yeah.
And I continually give this, this is the third year in a row I've given or chosen to give a lecture about intersectionality. And I find it impossible because there's just no way I could possibly cover that topic in a 2-hour seminar. And it's like, yet year after year, I set myself that task because I think I can't just go back to feminism and just show feminist art. And I don't know. It just, so yeah, I agree. It's impossible.
There's a kind of tension, isn't there? It's like, if you're inclusive, you might misrepresent somebody or a position.
Yes, exactly. Because then I feel like I have to be an expert on things that I clearly am not an expert on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, I've just tried to be really honest and said, look, this is who I am. I live in this country. I'm a white woman. These are my experiences. They're not everybody's experiences, but that's how it is. It's like, why would I lie? Or I'm not going to lie, but, why would I try to...
But you don't feel any kind of feeling that you must like I'm saying, this kind of feminist impulse to decenter obviously you can't decenter maleness in a book on maleness, but you could decenter other attributes that are assigned privilege or whatever, or advantaged, you could say.
Yeah, I mean,
and you could choose to,
I suppose I'm partly, as I said at the beginning, criticizing that generalizing language of privilege and so on, and saying, look, it doesn't work to apply it to the whole category of men, for example. So it's
right, because of differences.
Trying to unpick that kind of generalizing tendency that exists in the culture, that would see like all masculinity as toxic, for example. So yeah, but it gets more messy and more complicated. But I think life is more complicated. I don't think anyone has the right line. However worthy they might think they are, or however moral, or however correct. We live in a kind of flux and a myriad of competing understandings of the world. And we have to try and make sense of it. And it's better to do that together. She says.
All right. When one of the talks you gave, you asked this question: should we want to have sex with loads of people? I think in the context of like pickup artists and the pickup artists turning 40, the ones who wrote the books called The Rules or whatever, like who made, turned it into a kind of science of like how to get women to have sex with them, and then suddenly they're turning 40 and now questioning like, how do I actually get in a relationship or wanting one? And then that question of like, should we want to have sex with loads of people? I just always think about that question in the context of our upbringing, now that I know you're the same age as me. And because I always thought, why aren't my brothers who are older than me, why aren't they having sex with loads of people? Like, why are they in monogamous relationships all the time? I never understood that. But the only justification I could see for that was the AIDS crisis. Like, you couldn't, like, that's why that would be that curtailed their, sexual freedom, if you will. Like, it wasn't morality, it wasn't like, whereas with me, it was like, you're a girl, so of course you couldn't go around sleeping with loads of people without being, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously that's a kind of individual thing. But when we're talking about kind of cultural shifts and things that are being encouraged by the broader culture, so talking about hookup culture or the apps, I talk about this in the book in terms of like, the worst thing you can do is like catch feelings, right? So the idea that everybody should be having sort of really non-intimate, non-emotional sex, as if that's like the apex of human achievement, is certainly being encouraged by a certain kind of culture, right? And so it's not about judgment. It's not about saying people should have more or less sex, but it's about saying, what world do we actually currently live in? And does this world have kind of unintended consequences? And I think sometimes it does. I think, I don't think it's particularly great for people to want to have intimate relationships, but sort of avoid them because they're worried that this is embarrassing. Also, it's embarrassing to say, I love you, or, should we do something serious, because that's not cool, or something like this, I think, and obviously when we're looking at forms of, I don't know, the relationship between economic exploitation and sexuality, that's a whole massive other topic, but, things like OnlyFans and the kind of, normalization of selling one's sexuality for money, again, we could probably think about nicer ways in which we could organize society, so.
That reminds me of two things. Like, one is like Arlie Hochschild, the sociologist, wrote an essay about self-help books and how they've changed their kind of timbre over time, like to being about cultivating, or about like the change in them represents a sort of cultural cooling, like how to deal with hookup culture versus like a book from the 70s, which would have been about, I don't know, maybe Eric Fromm. I don't know if that's self-help, but, like the art of loving or something, Yeah. So now we've like, if culture was cooling when Arlie Hochschild wrote that essay, then now we're in like, it's freezer territory. It's like Ice Age or something. It's so cold, which I think is what, Misha Badassian, who slept with one man every day of the year kind of, his project is all about that.
Yeah, but it's interesting that the most moved he was talking about the fact that he had a boyfriend, right? So, I mean, I get the project in a way, his exploration of that possibility, and it's an art project, and I understood it that way. But he was most moved to talk about his intimate relationship, the fact that he found somebody to be with, So, I mean, all of this makes me and anyone who talks like this sound very old-fashioned and as if we're judging people who behave differently. But I don't think it's like that. I think it's...
Yeah. But on another O show where I interview Marianne Moncho, who was a sex worker in the 90s after she got her PhD, she didn't get a job at Goldsmiths and then decided to go, to become a sex worker. And she became kind of an advocate for sex workers. And one of the things that comes across in that interview is that and also in the interview with Marissa Begonia, who's a domestic worker, is that there seems to be a dearth of care, or like people seem to need these. We import people from other parts of the world to take care of our children, for example, or men go to prostitutes, not necessarily for sex, but to talk about their feelings or to feel a sense of something that I don't know. Anyway, yeah, it just seems like there's a lack of care, and we're needing to get it from these different places, and I don't know what the solution to that is. I mean, of course, it's a huge question. Of course, I don't know the solution, but yeah, I don't know where I'm going with this question. It's not a question. It's just once again. No,
I mean, I don't disagree with like the way you're presenting it. I think it's. I
guess the question is though, like if men, I think part of the potential solution is that if men took on more care and domestic work, that there would be a balance struck, you could argue.
And that's to do with the economy. I mean, I think a lot of men would like to do that, to be honest, and yes. I think we're going to see major changes in employment in the next few years anyway, because of automation, and obviously the lockdown is kind of given a gateway to employers to perhaps destroy all small businesses and everything else. So I mean, I think there will be major shifts that are not to do with sex exactly, but will have implications for families and childcare, like absolutely, right? And so I mean, I think I don't know, I think a lot of younger people, some of them have really become more traditionalist in certain ways. I think the sexual revolution is maybe over in a certain way. Like I think it's it happened in the 60s or whenever Philip Larkin says, but that maybe we're in the kind of, we've had the terror phase if we base it on the French Revolution, with Me Too, and now we're in Thermidor, which is a kind of more balanced approach. So it's not just pure libidinal expression and the sexual revolution, but rather trying to integrate desire back into meaningful relations, when a lot of communities and things have been destroyed by capitalism and by these forms of work. So I think maybe we'll see more thoughtful approaches to more traditional structures in certain ways, I think.
So in the world, according to Nina Power, like going forward into a utopian vision of the future, what does that look like?
Well, it's not utopian at all. I think utopia is in a way the problem, because a lot of people think, well, if we can just do this, then we'll have utopia. And utopia has always been this kind of like dream, particularly of the left. And so I think to confront reality and say, like, this is the world we're in, like, this is how things are. It's not that things can't change, but we also have to accept a certain reality, and not think, oh, we can transform everything overnight and, have a wholly, completely different new world. I think, again, it's very boring. It becomes very boring.
Okay, I think I've asked all my questions.
Okay, so shall I stop the recording?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
yeah, I feel like we'll just go back around in the same kind of path. So that concludes my discussion with Nina Power. I hope you enjoyed it or got something out of it. Thank you for listening. I must say, I'm not sure I got out of it what I most wanted to. I wanted to focus on cis men, on hegemonic masculinity and the groups and politics that have come out in the wake of Me Too, which Nina Power is now very well versed in, having researched her book. But I feel like we kind of didn't talk about that much and ended up talking about other things, which is partly informed by the fact that I had invited another guest to be in this podcast series, and they rejected the invitation on the basis of not wanting to share a platform with Nina Power. And I felt out of a kind of responsibility to that person and to any of my listeners who identify as trans or non-binary, that I felt I had this duty to challenge Nina Power's potentially problematic views around sex and gender. I don't think I did a particularly great job of doing that. And I shared the podcast interview, a much longer edit of it, with a friend who works deeply in trans politics and is deeply invested in these topics, for his opinion about it. And having heard his opinion, I then re-edited it to an interview you just listened to, which omits some of our conversation, especially when it touches on Nina's views on sex and gender. And I didn't do this to censor her or myself, but rather because I wanted to, again, stay true to my intention, which was to discuss her new book. I think ultimately those who have the most at stake or who have the most skin in the game are the ones who should have the loudest voices and be platformed. So a conversation between two cis women about trans identity and gender and sex, like, to me, doesn't seem like the best use of this platform. But I do want to agree with Nina when she's talked about living in a pluralist world and people having different beliefs and experiences, and therefore we need to figure stuff out together and through conversation. In my discussion with Susan Butler on the previous episode, I was forced to recognize the fact that my reunion fantasies can sometimes render me ignorant to the truth. And I think, I have that same fantasy around Nina Power, and those and the person who rejected my invitation. Like, I want to find a way that these people can have a meaningful dialogue that might change, that might not necessarily that Nina should change her views, and but more that we might find a common ground and a way in which we might work together to combat what are the real causes of oppression or inequality and inequity in our world, that we might move forward together as a kind of unified front on the left. Which maybe I'm being completely naive in thinking that's possible. And I find this medium, or maybe the way I'm using it, to be kind of limited and problematic. Like, I really want to have a conversation, facilitate a conversation between someone like Nina Power or Nina Power herself and some of the other guests I've had on the podcast, with who hold opposing views. So hopefully I can make that happen. Maybe not. We'll see.
Next time on Multiple O's. Next time on...
Importantly, the next episode will take hopefully not too long to come out. I've been working hard on it for quite some time, actually. It's a little bit different from past episodes because I'm attempting to use old recordings that I made with the artist Catherine Araniello. I wanted to honor her memory by sharing the interviews I did with her for my doctoral research I'm hoping that I can improve the sound quality enough to be able to share those discussions with you. So that's something to look forward to next time on Multiple O's. Thank you so much for listening. If you're enjoying the series, please support me via patreon.com/OrianaFox. And even if you don't, I'll go on accepting myself unconditionally, accepting my life and other people unconditionally as well. And I hope you do too, because we're all just fallible human beings. Oh